So good evening, everybody. I'm Gary Seymour, director of the Cran Center for Middle East Studies. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening for a really special event. We're going to be discussing a new book published by the Crown Center, Arabs and Israelis, from October 7 to Peacemaking, with the three authors of the book, Shai Feldman, who's a Raymond Frankel Chair in Israeli Politics and Society and Professor of Politics at Brandeis, Abdel Monem Said Aly, who's the chairman of the Al-Masry Al-Youm publishing house in Cairo and former director of the Regional Center for Strategic Studies in Cairo, and Khalil Shikaki, director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah, which is the most preeminent public research organization in Palestine. It's not the first time that these three authors, an Israeli, an Egyptian, and a Palestinian, have joined forces to work on the Arab-Israeli conflict. They've co-authored a very well-known textbook called Arabs and Israelis, Conflict and Peacemaking in the Middle East, which is in its second edition. And they've co-taught a course here at Brandeis of the same name for many years. This new book is an effort to consider whether the suffering and the violence unleashed by October 7 might actually create conditions for pursuing a peace process if leaders are willing to take those opportunities. I'm going to ask each of them to make some introductory remarks, and we'll have a conversation. Then I'll ask for questions from the audience, try to give students first chance to ask questions. And then I have some questions from people who are Zooming in the webinar. First of all, I want to thank Lester Crown, whose generosity made it possible to establish the Crown Center for Middle East Studies 20 years ago. I want to thank Marcia Rickless, who supported this project very generously. I also want to mention that because it's cold outside, we're going to be raffling Crown Center hats. So those of you who got a number, wait around after, and if you're lucky, you'll get one of these very handsome and warm hats to wear home. Thank you. So let's get started. Shai, I want to start with you. I want to ask sort of a big question.
So before you do that,
yeah,
can I just add another thank you?
Sure.
First of all, I'm the self-appointed shepherd of this trio. We did get together exactly 20 years ago to start teaching at Brandeis, this class that Gary mentioned. But I also want to his thanks, to I think at least mention another person, then president of Brandeis University, Yehuda Reinhardt, who it was his vision to create the Crown Center, and it was his determination that it would be a center that would kind of defy the common wisdom that the Middle East is such a politicized subject that it's impossible to conduct balanced and dispassionate research. And it was basically the support of Lester Crown that he mobilized that allowed all this to happen. And finally, one more thank you that I want to mention is the associate director of the Crown Center, who's sitting behind us, just making sure that we're okay, Christina Chernyshevsky. I actually hired her on the phone before we actually physically got together to create the Crown Center. So she's part of the 20-year group. And I probably drove her completely crazy with my perfectionism in 15 years. And the result of this perfectionism is one of the most aesthetically one of the most beautiful publications that I've seen. I call it. I'm allowed to call it aesthetically. Everything else is our responsibility, but the aesthetics is Christina, and I think it's perfect. So I want to thank Christina for returning. So this is also not the first time that a major event happens in the Middle East, and at least two, if not all three of us, get together first by phone, then more recently by Zoom, to decide if whether we can do something about it. In this particular case, I think what was common to the three of us was this notion that maybe, and there were a few examples in history where a really, really, really horrible period or horrific development brought about positive changes. We can think of certainly the Second World War. It was very difficult to talk anything positive during the war, but the Second World War was followed by the establishment of the UN, and then later the European Union and NATO, and so on and so forth. Or when you think about the killing fields in Southeast Asia, when you think about Vietnam and what Vietnam as a destination for Israeli tourism nowadays. So you can see that some real disasters can, in the end, bring some positive. So what really got us together was this question: is it possible that something like the horrors of October 7 and the horrors of the things that happened after October 7 can yield something positive? And I think the corollary to this question, in that sense, I guess I'm anticipating the skepticism that is only natural in situations like that. Again, because of the realities that we've been experiencing since October 7, is why do we think that there is a chance in the world that what we propose here might succeed, where everything that happened in the last 31 years since Oslo to resolve this conflict, or every effort, has failed miserably. So what's changed? Those who share with me the Jewish predisposition will note that we are coming close to Passover, and the dinner is called the Seder. And one of the questions we ask in the Seder is, what's the difference between this night and all other nights? So in this case, we're asking, what's the difference between, why would we think that there is any chance in the world that something positive can happen? And I will just note three things, and my colleagues, I am sure, will either disagree with me or expand on them, or both. The first thing that I think is different is that we place a very big emphasis on the role of the region in helping resolve this conflict. No effort, whether it's Oslo, whether it's the Clinton efforts, whether it's the Annapolis process, all of these efforts were bilateral, Israeli-Palestinian efforts to resolve their conflict. But the problem is that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was never purely bilateral. Jerusalem is an issue that is all Arab and it's all Muslim. There is no solution, whether it's, well, I don't want to put too much advertisement on President Trump's proposal, but it's a good example that the refugees and so on, it doesn't have a solution, a real solution, purely in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So here the issue is, we are emphasizing, we put great emphasis on the role of the region, and I think it's also based on the fact that it's a different region, that it's a region that has moved from geopolitics to geoeconomics. moving from just power grabbing to the effort to achieve greater prosperity. And I think there is a lot of evidence. The region has already been involved. Qatar has been involved. Egypt has been involved, even already in the efforts to, for example, create a ceasefire that's shaking right now, but still. So that's the first major difference between what we've seen before and what we've seen now. Until now, all the efforts were bilateral, and they all basically failed partly because it's not really a purely bilateral conflict. The other thing that differs the proposal here is that we put great emphasis on another aspect that no peace initiative that was offered until now placed a lot of emphasis on, which is how to market domestically, how to market a deal. So people worked diligently and creatively on coming up with solutions, but didn't actually elaborate how would the leaders be able to sell those solutions to their domestic constituencies, which is again something that we put considerable emphasis to. And the third, I think, reason why all the previous efforts, and I think we also share that all the previous efforts have failed, was the reluctance of third parties, especially the US, to exercise any significant leverage. Now it seems we finally have a president of the United States that has no inhibitions about using leverage. Whether any of this would work or not, we have to see. But at least there is a chance. And by the way, I do think that, yes, the proposal for the ceasefire that is shaking right now was cooked up already last April. But somehow it needed President Trump's threats. They sometimes have a clarifying effect, both on the Israeli leadership and the Palestinian leadership, to actually get this done. And again, it's all very shaky right now. But it does demonstrate the fact that leverage was missing, and there is some observables here to see what happens when somebody that has potential leverage and decides to exercise the leverage, whereas previous presidents with all the goodwill and other third parties were very, very reluctant to use that leverage. I think in all these three respects, what we have come up with is very different from what we've seen in the last 32 years since Oslo. But I'm sure that my colleagues will elaborate both on the ideas that we have here about how to market this, how leaders can market this domestically, and the role of the region in this new constellation. With this, I will end.
Thank you, Shai. You make it easy to moderate by answering my questions before I ask them. So
we've also been together for quite some time by now.
So I want to turn to Abdel Monem and ask you about the regional dimension. It's something that is really emphasized in the book. And as an Egyptian, you're very familiar with both the countries that can help and the countries that will act as spoilers, such as Iran. So I want to ask you, how do you empower countries that favor a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians, and how do you foil and respond to countries that want to act as spoilers?
Thank you very much, Gary. That's a lot of responsibility. Thank you all for coming with that kind of cold weather and for an important, I think, topic, at least for us in the region. I just like to remind you, the history of the Middle East is, there is saying for Charles de Gaulle when he is asked, about anything, he said, bring the maps. So in the maps, the Middle East was always, and particularly in the Palestinian-Israeli area, was the crossing of all, the empires of the world, from the Egyptians to the Romans, the Mesopotamians, Greeks, whatever, and also the Crusades. You go to the present world of Second World War, you found the area was really a focus of a lot of conflict. So we are, have two things. There was conflict, but there was also peaceful periods, and people there resilient enough to deal with the situation. With our situation now, why we emphasize the regional approach in our work is actually the failure of all other things. The failure of all other things, because we found also that when we study peace, it was always bilateral, not regional. It was Sadat going to Jerusalem, that was the breakaway. And after that, the Jordanian one, King Hussein and Ishaq Rabin and others. And I will say also when we have the Ibrahimite peace, it was directly, and I will say why, between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. So it was regional, or states from the region that took the initiative. Coming with the United States usually come later for the signing of the agreements, and also for organizing aid here and there and supporting the process. So also even when we started making something called the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, we started to learn from the world experience that countries can cooperate over functional issues like gas, like in the European experience, we have the iron and steel experiment. So we have here, a situation in which only peace comes when there is a regional effort or localized effort. When the other parties come to the field, and I mean by the other parties, their interference, particularly that we had in the past decade or so, the proliferation of non-state actors in the region, and non-state actors that are armed militias, and in a way not only threatening the tension in the region, but also threatening, I will say, the existence of states like Syria, like Lebanon, like Iraq, and also on the Palestinian-Israeli area. So we have that, and counter to it is that the Arab Spring, which is, I will consider another beginning of contemporary period in the region, is really generated three trends. One of them was the youthful trend, and which want to, try to take off regimes. But also the Muslim Brothers, which represented a tayar of religious fundamentalism in the region. And I will say number three is people who said, well, we cannot keep fighting all life. And I will say that the experiment of the Gulf here, which we consider tiny sheikdoms and stuff like this, but we have popping in the desert cities like Dubai, like Abu Dhabi, like Doha, like, you don't hear from Baghdad, the old cities, or Damascus or Cairo. In this region, that the idea that we can build states. You can really, if you can have a period of time to develop, then you can create, and with the technology now, knowledge of the world, the experience of Southeast Asia, I think no less mature than the experience in Europe. Shai talked about, how the Second World War affected the European peace. I will say the Vietnam War, which was linked to it, the Cambodian War, the Laotian War, all the communist fighting parties in most of the Southeast Asian created the hell region. But finally they said, well, wait, look at Japan, how Japan developed. Look at South Korea, how it developed. So China was even with Li Xiaoping was really starting to rise. So they made ASEAN, and ASEAN became actually another oasis of peace in the world. So that's one of the things inspired us in looking at the situation that now we are into it, that started on October 7. And it didn't start on October 7 because we have something that was festering in the previous decades after the failure of the 1990s experiments with the Oslo Agreement and after of it. So now we have a mission that the region will play a part. And I will assign the region here is defined in 9 states. The 6 states of the Gulf, Egypt, and Jordan, and Morocco. The 9 countries that don't have a civil war, they don't have a famine, they don't have any of the sickness that you can find in the states in the Middle East and in Africa and other places. I will say these 9 states really made a declaration on the 21st of October, a few days after the October 7, that condemned what happened in October 7 by being an act of attacking at civilians, and also what happened after that, of not only attacking civilians, but also diminishing an entire area of people and construction. So attacking civilian became a target that to be preventing because the bloodshed was really heavy. So the burden of the mission is, I will say, symbolized by these 9 states. Some of them already in peace with Israel. Some of them were on the track to the peace with Israel. But unfortunately, the October 7 was meant literally, in my opinion, really to disrupt that process, to disrupt the process of continuing to rebuilding. Because you can't build in a region with your environment is really in trouble. So the attempt to try to cross that was really spoiled, and unfortunately, the revenge was very harsh. And a continuation of a period of occupation that really made the situation in the Palestinian areas really fermenting the kind of reaction. I want to emphasize an important factor here in the region is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was one of the richest countries in the region because of per capita income, whatever you like to have indicators. But the real thing was the most backward, conservative, traditional, ugly country. Actually, I never visited Saudi Arabia until the last decade. And I can't just go and in a place that you can talk with people and women are not there and the airports are actually fully by Indians and all people, but not the people themselves. To take that and to change it is a really revolutionary social and economic revolution that made the country is member of the G20 and also a leader in the process that started to work, trying to work. The ceasefire, it was Egypt and Qatar, but also it was Saudi Arabia to supporting this process in a different ways. So here we are into the, the process that you have in the book, in which was really a collaboration between us. Shai actually talked with the idea with me, and I told him I'm thinking that thing. I sent to him email that's what I'm thinking exactly. We have to do something, but we don't know about how to get the money to do these things. He did, and Marsha, was a very solid, help throughout our latest career. And then the idea of having 2 things that became important. One is that we should have a transitional period. And this one was Khalil's idea, to have a transitional period. And his polling was really sensitive to the developments that's already on the ground and how people can accept certain things or not to accept them. And the regional factor, I talked with it, was about it was Shai, and even we would call it the wow thing, the thing that can make a core to how we develop from here. I think now that's what's needed. And the problem is sometimes in politics and in international relations, there is always something come out. I must say I am surprised by the success of Donald Trump to be the president of the United States. And initially I thought that we dealt with a lot of people, but now we are into a phase that I think the approach we have in the book and the way of thinking can lead us to how to deal with the new current and complicated situation. Thanks.
Thanks, Abdel Monem. So I want to drill down a little bit on the Palestinian side of this equation. The book is very clear, I would say even brutally clear, on the need to strengthen Palestinian institutions and leadership. So how can that be done under the circumstances that are currently exist in the West Bank and Gaza? And is there a risk that efforts at reform, if there's an election, won't it just bring Hamas to power, as it did in 2005?
Well, like all the other actors, in this monograph, we assign tasks for them, what role they can play. After we identify all their deficits. And the Palestinian Authority has a lot of deficits, most importantly, that it has no legitimacy. So it basically starts with a situation where it cannot play a constructive role unless it is able to restore that legitimacy. As Al-Monem said, in the architecture that we do have phases for how things will proceed. Shai addressed our long-term vision and what we have in mind, and how we can use the ability of both sides to send messages to each other in order to help them build a constituency. In the transitional phase, we face a situation in which, first and foremost, we need to restore some sort of legitimacy so that the Palestinian Authority can become acceptable, to be able to play a role during that transition. We propose that there should be a Palestinian government that is transitional for 2, perhaps 3 years, in which Gaza and the West Bank would come under a strong prime minister. We're not removing the president. The Palestinian constitutional rules prevent us from removing the president, even though 80 to 90% of the Palestinians now tell us they want him out. We still think that we do not want to destroy the entire constitutional structure of the Palestinian Authority. That constitutional structure gives us the ammunition we need to create this transitional authority with a strong prime minister. In the Palestinian constitutional rules, a prime minister does not report to the president. He or she reports to the Palestinian parliament. Since we don't have a parliament, and of course that parliament gives a vote of confidence, we see a need for consensus among the Palestinians, including Hamas, so that that transitional government has the support of the Palestinian public and all the factions, and a strong prime minister for a transitional period, during which the basic needs of the transitional period, which includes the ceasefire that is underway today. Of course, we don't know whether the ceasefire is going to last. Right now, it looks very fragile. It is really not sustainable to a large extent because it is not grounded, it's not embedded in any kind of agreed transitional arrangements or a long-term vision. Our own ideas basically say we must have these transitional arrangements in place, and that the ceasefire must be part of those transitional arrangements, and that those transitional arrangements are certainly unsustainable unless they are part and parcel of a long-term vision of peace. So there are essentially three elements: a ceasefire, transitional arrangements, and long-term peace. Within that context, a transitional Palestinian government that then leads to elections before we have the implementation of permanent peace in which a new government, elected government, can sign. That's basically our vision. In the short term, therefore, what we need is significant restructuring of the current Palestinian Authority so that we can have that kind of legitimacy that would make the government acceptable, that will therefore provide not necessarily a consensus, but a significant support for the difficult decisions that would be made during the transitional period leading up to permanent peace.
Thank you, Khalil. So I think we have to talk about President Trump. Since you finished your work, since you finished the book, we've experienced the Trump effect. He seems to have certainly been influential in bringing about the ceasefire. He's also put forward a very unusual proposal for dealing with the Palestinians in Gaza. He wants to talk to the Iranians. He wants a normalization deal with the Saudis, although he may be making it more difficult for them to accept one. But I want to ask each of you to just spend a few minutes talking about the Trump effect. Is there method in his madness? Is he a brilliant negotiator? Is he unhinged? Which are maybe all of the above? So talk a little bit about Trump, his effect on the region, how he's perceived in the region, and where you think he's going in the next near future. Who wants to start?
You want to talk about the region?
Yes. Well, I am not used to talk about, the president of other countries, except the United States. So I will take that duty by saying that I was totally surprised by his winning. And actually with the ideas that he came about after it. And I must tell you that with all the experience that I got in 50 years of work, I don't really know what he wants to do. I'm not sure that my American colleagues, because what we have here, something like moving the United States of America to being like a kingdom or empire, talking about Canada or talking about Greenland or that's kind of tradition and historical kinds of expansionism that happens between powerful states and weaker states. The language is very, very not, having the softness of international law and human international law and other things that human beings invented after harsh wars. And he really is talking about it with bold face. I mean, just talking with the Prime Minister of Denmark, I thought she will have a heart attack. Because nobody talked. We have been going back and forth from Africa to here through the Greenland. I mean, you see it from the plane. So here, that's a package. And then I get, very sympathetic with the American people when I see that the whole federal government subject to a process of a change that's fundamental. Actually, the more I will talk, I will give evidence that we have in a big transitional period in the American life, I will say since the Second World War. I mean, the one afterwards, how to deal with the post-war era, a little bit with the post-Vietnam era as well. But we have something fundamental here, internally, related to everything that's studied about American politics, from the Constitution to the human rights movement in the 1960s. There is something serious is happening. And when it happens in a country that has 26% of the world GDP and have the fastest and the heaviest and the biggest armed forces in the world, in a time in which the AI and the other technological things can do what every technology did. It can be like fire. You know, you get warm from it, or it destroys and burn a lot of things. His position today in the Middle East is really very, also, I will say, I look at it with terror. The way he put things together today, it was like the Middle East was King Abdullah and he was the president of the United States. Between Jordan, small country that's created in a special circumstances, and tried this country from the beginning, from our study, to have peace with Israel. And when they could, they did it. But yet, you know, the very powerful are saying, well, I'll give you 1 million people, in which he has already half of his population are Palestinians. And there is something about the identity of the country that should be kept diversified. So my short answer, what's the Middle East of President Trump? It is horror. And horror actually leads to two things. Something we did in the past. I mean, during the nationalist movement in the 1950s and 60s, we fight imperialism and we fight everybody, and everybody fight us. And then we have 1967 war. I mean, that is something that my generation lived with it in the last 50 years. The price is very high. Horror also gets you into another thing that's feel you know, I have to say, I am a speaker, I'm a senator, I have to make a position. And actually, we will not accept any immigration of the Palestinians to Egypt. Not because we dislike them, or we cannot talk with them, or we don't eat their food. No, we actually, Egypt absorbed all the refugees of the 1948, and the world lied to us. They told us, take them, and then they will go back. They never went back. And actually, they became part of Egypt. But that was not nice for them, you know, their identity. So now they are telling us the same thing, while in Egypt, we have 9.5 million refugees in Egypt from states in Africa, you wouldn't believe, and Sudan and Syria. And also we have 150,000 Palestinians who are studying in Egypt and living before the war. During the war, we absorbed another 112,000 who came for, you know, looking for treatment of the war. Just a few days ago, when there was a ceasefire, Egypt absorbed another 10,000 because they are injured. So we offered the help. By the way, nobody knows that all the aid to Gaza during this period, 70% of it is from Egypt. So we did our duty here. However, to take more and force it to do this, that's not an Egyptian thing. And do it in, you know, on television. That's not how presidents talk to each other. To say, they will take it. So we will say, no, we can take it. So he will say, but anyway, you will take it. That's really is one thing after another that make us, as I said, for somebody like me who tried to look and have a decision, that is a horror, because we were doing, despite of everything, well, in the last 10 years. Despite the COVID, despite the terrorism, we have more universities than we have more schools than we have more cities than we had before. And we moved from the River Nile to the beaches of the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. So we were trying. That's now all is in the brink of another phase of this crisis. We have a ceasefire to respect. I think also Hamas got to respect it. There is no here in human beings like the hostages to say for 3 or 4, I will postpone it. I have imprisoned once. I know what does it mean to be caged in a place. But, and I have been in war also, and I have seen a lot of it. So I will say, now pushing us to explode the entire situation, there is no so far. I hope things will change. I hope my friends will tell me good news. Because really, we are tired of it. We are tired of it. But if we started a new cycle, from my experience, it goes on for time being, for a decade or two coming. Sorry, Gary.
Thanks. Thanks, Abdel Monem.
But
Khalil, why don't you tell us what your analysis of Trump's Middle East policy is?
I think if Trump, there are two possibilities here: that he's insane and using that insanity as a negotiating tactic. Assuming that is the case, his goal is to perhaps encourage the Saudis to get involved in a normalization deal with Israel, knowing that Israel is not going to be able to deliver the goods that the Saudis are asking for. So an insane offer, as the one he's making, would be the bargaining chip in which the Saudis can deliver normalization in return for him to pull out, to basically forget about it. But let's assume he's serious. If he is serious, then I think he is on his way to destabilize the entire region. He will destroy the stability in Jordan and Egypt that have been, the Jordanians have done their best and have been one of the most stable since the 70s. And Egypt, after the Arab Spring and everything that had happened, and the terrorism in Sinai and all of that, could find itself again having to face a great deal of stabilization. The immediate impact of such destabilization will be essentially gradually destroying the Israeli peace treaties with these two countries. And it will probably strengthen Hamas while doing it. So these are all possibilities. We now see the Iranian axis of resistance being weakened, significantly weakened during the last few months. And that is certainly one way in which Trump could bring back the axis of resistance with new forces. The Iranians could see common ground with the Egyptians and the Jordanians and everybody else in the region who can see how threatening these ideas are. I think I'm hoping that the Israelis are a little bit more careful, even though Netanyahu might not be, for his own personal interest. But I think the Israelis understand that while Trump's real estate logic might lead him in one direction, Israelis know the history of the region. They understand the limitations, and they know that such crazy ideas could be destructive to their own interests, not just to the interests of the Egyptians and the Jordanians. So I don't know what to make of it. I think, and I hope that what Trump is hoping for is a negotiating tactic. But if he is serious and he does not abandon this idea very soon, I think he will be doing a great deal of damage, irreparable damage to America's best friends in the region.
One thing we know about President Trump is that he treats friend and foe alike.
Yes.
So, Shai, let me ask you about the reaction in Israel. I mean, we know that some of Netanyahu's government think that this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship, as Ben-Gvir said. At the same time, we know that Prime Minister Netanyahu was wary of angering Trump, since he is capable of lashing out. So how do you think the Trump effect affects Israeli politics and calculations?
First of all, I'm really, really glad that we finished work on the book before the election. Based on the comments that my colleagues just made, it probably would have taken another 4 months just to deal with the after effects of the change in government here. I'm going to try to be just slightly more analytical to say that as scholars, we have to look for what are the building blocks of trying to predict, where this is going. And I think the place to start is to analyze, what Trump did during his first term on this particular issue, not, other issues. And I think that the record is mixed. But, when I say it's mixed, it means that there are not only negative dimensions, but there are also some positive dimensions. I would say I'll start with the negative. Clearly, the so-called deal of the century that Trump advertised and created expectations about was a complete disaster. It was a disaster. You could read the components of the disaster in a Middle East brief of the Crown Center that Khalil and I wrote, because it stipulated exactly what would be the minimal requirements for this to succeed. And the minimal requirements were not met. None of them were met. So that's clearly on the negative side. But it was actually still belonged to this effort to deal with this issue bilaterally. Right? The deal of the century was a bilateral deal. It wasn't a multilateral deal. It was not a regional deal. Then there are two other issues, developments that you have to give Trump credit for. One is the Abraham Accords. The fact that the reason why we have, at least we believe that there is a potential for some positive change, and that the potential for positive change starts with the region, is because, as Abdel Monem said earlier, we have something to work with in the region, which we didn't have. We had peace with Egypt and we had peace with Jordan. But now but thanks to the Abraham Accords, we have 3 additional Arab countries, four if you count, I don't,
Bahrain.
although I thought you were going to Sudan.
Well, Sudan, yes.
Yeah, I'll leave Sudan a little bit aside here, but it's fine. So either 4 or 5, so either 3 or 4, so which means either 4 or 5 Arab countries, including some very, very significant ones. So there is a critical mass of Arab countries that are now in formal relations with Israel. And we know where the Saudis were until this disruption of October 7th. There was an interview that the Crown Prince gave to Fox News just shortly before October 7th, in which he said, every day we're coming closer to normalization. So we know where the Saudis are. So, and this one has to say, you can't, if you're giving, Trump negative points for his failures, you also have to recognize that there were some achievements. That's number one. The second one that I would mention is, and this is something that in the quote unquote intellectual discourse is sometimes, put it this way, not always sufficiently stated. And that is because we've been now talking, about the axis of resistance, of everything that Iran built, of this, circle of fire that Qasem Soleimani built, and that Sinwar counted on when he decided to launch October 7. And it is impressive. One has to take it. The Iranian project was quite impressive. And when you read the strategic thinking behind it, whether it's Soleimani or especially Nasrallah is the grand thinker here, it is impressive. What's not being credited for is the fact that the US built a counter-axis. The US built it, and here, remember that one of the main developments here was that the same administration, the Trump administration, made a decision that many people in the US armed forces were advocating for a long time, to move Israel from Europe to the Middle East. Europe, in the way the American commands are organized, was part of EUCOM, was the European Command, because of the previous, let's say, negative relationships between states in the Middle East, and the reluctance of Arab countries to see Israel as a partner. They recognize that things have changed, and they moved Israel to Central Command. Central Command, I just want to remind you, the headquarters is in Tampa, Florida. The command in the region is in Qatar. So, and this created a situation in which Israel found itself now in the last few years, Israeli officers in constant contact and familiarity with military officers from all these Arab countries that are, under CENTCOM. And there is, and you see the results of that, because 2 Iranian attacks on Israel during this war were basically defeated. And they weren't defeated by Israel, and they weren't defeated by the United States. They were defeated by a coalition of countries, including, by the way, countries that, frankly speaking, I did not believe that I would see, with this problematics of Jordanian policy, that we would see an attack on Israel that is largely interdicted on Jordanian airspace. This is, you can't just put this aside and, oh, it's not important. It's very important. It's part of the story. And again, I just go back to this. This is something that the Trump administration did. So now what do we have? We have a problem. We have a problem that I don't think that, first of all, what do we have with Trump? In addition to everything else that everybody already pointed to, and I don't argue with that, but I think Trump has some instincts. It's clearly not analysis-based, but it's instinct-based, and not all the instincts are negative. So on the negatives, we already heard. But what I think is an instinct here is that Trump is driven by this notion, a very simple notion, is war is bad for business. War is bad for business. Now, would Netanyahu be happy about the implications of this instinct that war is bad for business? No, because in the interview that Trump gave just 2 days ago, he was talking about opening negotiations with Iran on the nuclear issue. Trust me, Netanyahu is not going to get too much sleep knowing that, because his notion, again, based on the track record of the first administration, anytime Trump talks about nuclear negotiations with Iran, Netanyahu thinks of the negotiations with North Korea. Not exactly the same outcome that Netanyahu would like to see. Now, the other issue that we have, and it's a real issue, is that, and we have the same issue here. The issue here is that, yes, Trump comes, again, one of the things he comes with is certain relationships that let's say he built, his son-in-law built, and so on and so forth, including Saudi Arabia. Now, the problem is that I don't discard for a second the fact that the Saudis are serious when they say the precondition for our involvement is that we need to know that in the end state of this process is a two-state solution. This is not façon de parler, as the French say. This is serious because the Saudis are serious, because the Saudis also have some internal and domestic issues and so on and so on. This is serious. Now, the same people that presumably are celebrating in Israel Trump, they pick and choose. They only pick what they like to hear in Trump, but they forget the other things that if they hear him carefully. So then the question is, which Trump are we talking about? And I think it's a mixed story. But what I certainly don't think is that it's one dimension, that it's all negative. And part of this is, of course, how the Arab leaders will play Trump, how Israel will play Trump. Okay, and we see how it made a difference. Trump has certain weaknesses. He's very weak. He's very susceptible and vulnerable and sensitive to praise. And I say, when the Palestinians decided, and understandably because of the mistakes that Trump made, about not just in the substance of the deal of the century, but in taking these steps on Jerusalem before the plan was even offered. Why not wait and make those wonderful changes that you wanted to make part of the plan and see how the parties would react? But he created an environment which made it almost impossible for the Palestinians to even have a discussion. And in fact, they didn't have a discussion. They did not engage the Trump administration in the conversation. Now, I would say, boy, why would the Palestinians not take a page out of North Korean diplomacy? If the North Koreans could learn how to manipulate Trump, why would the Palestinians fail so miserably in trying to deal with this phenomenon? So, and I say this because we have to remember it's not a black and white, and it's not binary. There are elements here and elements here, and the issue is what do we do with that? How do we build with, let's say, those elements that are where there is hope? Because depression and skepticism that's where the region is, and especially where the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is, especially exacerbated by October 7 and everything that followed October 7. So, anyway.
So I should mention that the three authors are going to be taking a tour to present their book in New York and Memphis and DC. So I'm hoping that some of your wisdom seeps through to the Oval Office. I'd like to take questions from the audience now. So if you're interested, please introduce yourself. Very short question.
And Christina reminds us that the mic is over.
There's a mic up here. Question always ends in a question mark. Anybody interested in asking a question? Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Yair Fuchson. I was here 20 years ago when the Crown Center was open, and I had the pleasure of taking your class. So it's nostalgic and a pleasure to see the three of you together again. I have two questions. I'd like to know about two things. One, the role of Qatar. I hear both negative and positive elements of influence from Qatar. Whether they're helping Hamas or whether they're acting as moderators. What is their impact on the region and on the situation? And the other is, I'm ignorant of Syria ever since they had their earthquake. I'd love to hear how you think the situation in Syria affects the region and this conflict in particular. Thank you.
Thank you. Abdel Monem, you want to just briefly?
Yes, I happened to live in Qatar for 3 years. I was a consultant to the Emir of Qatar, the grandfather of the current Emir. And Qatar is a very small country. It's 12,000 square kilometers. And with a population, original population of 350,000, but with 9 million people there. But the original ones are the Qataris with the nationality. The rest are people like, you find that in Kuwait and in United Arab Emirates, in which the majority is people coming from everywhere. Qatar as a small country, but it was discovered that it's very rich because it got gas. I was there when that, not because of the discovery, but because it was started to be industrialized. Gas is different than oil in terms of selling it to the world. And the first customer was Japan. So all of a sudden, at the time, it was the population was 120,000 almost. Now they increased. So here, a country that has got that capability of money, what to do with it? And we find that something in the Gulf about the evolution of the Gulf states, that you have to do something to prove yourselves. And what they did, they have Al Jazeera channel, network, television. It's still in the Arab world, it changed the Arab world in many ways, in terms not only of communication, but also with the art of communication to become much more provocative. And in many ways, it defends everything that's not originally Qatari. For instance, they are the most Arab nationalists and the most liberal Arabs and the more Islamic people. So they take the things that's really ideologically were from different schools in the Middle East, and it become in the network of Al Jazeera. So Al Jazeera was the one that's played a role in this crisis by almost adopted Hamas and Hezbollah and others. In terms of news, but that was something affecting the population in one side, but on the other, Qatar itself was really playing politics because it hosted the leadership of the CENTCOM in the region. So in one hand, they have the most important symbol of American existence, and in the same time calling, and they got away with it. And in many ways, they got trained to accepting to be, usually the moderator in the Middle East was Oman, which are also another sultanate, but with much more history than Qatar and the rest. Sultanate of Oman was crucial to the nuclear negotiation between Iran and the United States. It was a middleman, and they don't talk much. But Qatar likes to be on the forefront. Now, Qatar can play an important role in this transitional state. In dealing with being Qatar, surprisingly, not in peace with Israel, yet it has a strong relationship with Israel. It was the one that supplied Hamas with finances throughout the Israeli government of Mr. Netanyahu. So the money comes from Qatar, and they give it to Hamas because they want Hamas to break away from the original Palestinian national movement. So here, Qatar is, I will say, we got to deploy it. In my thinking, that with the starting point we got with the countries who made peace with Israel already. And these guys got to talk to Israelis directly. And also talking to Mr. Trump directly, that there is ceiling on what we are doing. We are already there. So please don't let us get back to where we were before. So Qatar is a symbolic of this. And I believe if the peace process worked out, they will be a good center of it. Particularly, in their mediation, they learned a lot. Qatar is still a small and modern state, but these kind of experiences create a cadre of people in the foreign ministry to do negotiations and then make the idea of mediation. So I think they were totally on the camp of peace cooperation with Egypt and the United States to get the ceasefire. Now the ceasefire is threatened. We will see what they will do.
Can I just add something to what Abdel Monem said? Abdel Monem is also very consistent, and I agree totally with him about the need for direct communication. And of course, President Sadat was the pathbreaker, coming to Israel and talking not to the Knesset, but actually talking above the heads of the government to the people, and actually changing Israeli domestic policy vis-a-vis the conflict. The second time this happened was on the eve of the Abraham Accords. This was during a period of 4 elections in Israel, and in one of them, Netanyahu was actively lobbying for annexing part of the West Bank. This was actually in the deal of the century, but in the deal of the century, it was supposed to be by agreement. He campaigned to annex parts of the West Bank unilaterally. Then the Emirati ambassador in Washington, D.C., Yusuf Otaiba, did a kind of a mini Sadat. He essentially initiated a 3-page interview in an Israeli newspaper that happened to be the most popular Israeli newspaper, especially on Fridays. And he talked directly to the Israeli people. And basically his message was, we're willing to embrace you. It was already in the Arab Peace Initiative, but he recognized this. But he said, but there is a cost. You have to give up this idea of annexation. We're not going to accept any annexation, and so on and so forth. So that prepared the Israeli population for what's coming, in this sense, the Abraham Accords. Now, again, something that wasn't paid a lot of attention to was only a week ago or so, the Prime Minister of Qatar gave an interview to Channel 12, Israeli television, okay, directly talking to the Israeli people, and not using any, roundabout language and so on and so forth. No, talking to the Israelis as, we are Qatar, you're Israelis, and giving them the impression that number one on one side is, we accept you, you're a legitimate, and we understand that you have problems and we have to do it, okay. But, there's also certain things that you have to accept. You, the Israelis, have to accept. And I think this has an effect. The effect precisely because for Israelis, the mere willing to communicate directly and talk to them directly is very important. Again, we have to contrast this with the mistakes that was done before the deal of the century, when the Trump administration took all these steps and they were unilateral and without any conversation or without any preparation and so on. That's the way you guarantee failure.
Any thoughts on the collapse of Assad and what the implications are for your recommendations?
I think it is too early for us to see Syria being part of the larger Middle East in at least the next 5 years. With Syria will be looking inward and trying to rebuild the state and the state institutions and so on. So for the short term, for the issues that we're looking at right now, I doubt very much that Syria will be able to directly play any role. However, depending on what happens during the next 5 years in terms of what direction Syria takes, particularly in terms of its relationship with Turkey and with Saudi Arabia, the extent to which it is able to find a balance between the two, that might have an impact. If it throws its weight completely with the Turks, including in terms of its military and the rebuilding of its army, then this puts Syria again back in conflict with Israel, and it could create a great deal of tension in the region, assuming the Israeli-Palestinian issue, of course, is still, I would imagine that would be the case. So that creates a new dynamics. However, if the Saudis do succeed in bringing them much closer to Egypt, Jordan, and the countries that are likely to normalize relations with Israel, this could then be a force for Israeli-Palestinian peace as well. That the success of the Saudis in convincing the current Syrian regime to join forces with these other Arab countries that are likely to normalize relations with Israel, it could provide an opportunity for Israeli-Palestinian peace as well. So I think it is too early to tell where Syria will be 5 years from now, but the decisions that will be made in those 5 years, particularly with regard to in what direction Syria will go, could have an impact on issues related to war and peace with Israel and on the Israeli-Palestinian front.
Can I also add on this one? I think this is actually one arena where the question marks are much, much greater than exclamation marks. And I agree with Khalil, but let me just add one more thing to this, which is Syria until now, in the last few years, has been an arena of for Israel at least, there were two challenges. One is Iran, and on the Syrian front, which is different from, let's say, Hezbollah, more complicated and so on, the Israeli policy was unequivocal, which is we will not allow, whatever the costs are, to Iran to become Israel's neighbor. Okay. So as far as, and all this, Israel adopted a doctrine called operations between wars. Mostly it was directed at preventing Iran from transforming Syria into a base against Israel. That's on one level. The second level is that Israel did adopt a very, very sophisticated policy vis-a-vis the Russians in Syria, okay, which had to do with a large degree of agreements on deconflicting, which created, in my view, a miracle. The miracle is that two air forces, the Syrian Air Force, the Russian Air Force and the Israeli Air Force, were operating in the same very, very narrow theater of operation without a single incident between the two of them. That required a degree of tactical coordination and communication that I haven't seen anywhere. And I think the fact that we've had these 5 or 6 years without a single incident is purely a miracle. The problem with the arena now is that we enter into a situation that's not black, like the issue with Iran, or white in the sense of successful deconflicting. The heavier involvement of Turkey in Syria, potential heavier involvement of Turkey, creates a situation, a very complex situation. And we still have to remember that Turkey is in NATO, is a member of NATO. What kind of complexities this would present for Israeli security policy, I think we're really only on the beginning, but I don't think it's going to be an easy ride by any stretch of imagination.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? Professor Bello?
Eva, there's a webinar, so
I can repeat it.
Where is Hamas now?
I guess I just don't understand, where is Hamas in this story? I mean, from the perspective of the Israeli right, Hamas is supposed to be liquidated. Hamas isn't about to just step down and say, ahlan wa sahlan. So where is Hamas in this whole story of your negotiations and new vision?
your problem,
Khalil, why don't
your
you
problem.
start with- And explain why Hamas is giving Netanyahu the gift of ending the hostage release so that he can start the war again.
I think Hamas is very much interested in continuing the ceasefire. Hamas has never left Gaza and is now showing clearly that it has never did and that it is in control. And the Israelis, after 15 months of war, while they were able to significantly diminish its military capacity, have not really been able to almost at all impact its governing capacity. And so Hamas is back in government, and it will remain there, and the residual military capacity that it still has is sufficient to make it extremely difficult for the Israeli army to be able to control Gaza without having to suffer daily casualties for a very, very long time to come, if the war comes back again. Hamas, therefore, has to be addressed as the de facto power in Gaza. This is true for both Israel, as Israel is treating it as such. The deal, ceasefire, is not a deal that is made with the Palestinian Authority. Israel is completely ignoring the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority is playing dead. And so, but if it is to have any role in Gaza, it has to be in coordination with Hamas. There is absolutely no alternative to that. And this is also true for Trump. If Trump thinks that he can just walk into Gaza, he would find that, first of all, he will need a lot of American troops on the ground if he wants to control Gaza. And that the American troops will be suffering the same number of casualties as the Israelis would be if the Israelis do come back. So I think Hamas wants to maintain the ceasefire. And it thinks, however, that Israel is not serious about the second phase. And it really wants to test that Israeli resolve. Does Israel want a second phase of the ceasefire? Or is Israel just interested in getting the first phase and some of the hostages out? And this is the test that they're basically throwing to Netanyahu. If Netanyahu does meet some of their demands, which basically simple demands, basically Hamas is saying Israel is not meeting its obligations with regard to the humanitarian issue. That's it. So Israel could easily meet those. If Israel does meet those, then I think Hamas will see this as a serious Israeli commitment to a second phase. If Israel doesn't, then Hamas is not losing anything, because Israel, in that case, would confirm that it is really not interested in moving into a second phase. So this is what Hamas is currently trying to test. I believe that's what they are currently after.
Go ahead, Abdel Monem.
Hamas is very important in a different way than what Khalil just said. I beg to differ here. I mean, one of the motivation for the regional approach is really the existence of non-state actors, and Hamas is one of them. I mean, the existence of non-state actors that really, in one time, Daesh established a whole caliphate in the Iraqi-Syrian border that really created havoc in the entire Levant area, including Iraq. And so that kind of ideology is not anymore what the stabilizing, moderating developer countries in the region. To make that solution to Hamas issue, Hamas did something that's to relieve a long period of occupation and suffering of the Palestinian people all over the last decades, particularly after the Second Intifada. After the Second Intifada continued the kind of serious kind of suppression. So Hamas used that, but yet it was a part of the axis of resistance, axis of non-state actors that are in Iraq, in Yemen, and in Syria. There is a plenty of names like Hezbollah, Islamic, whatever. So there was the Hamas now is, I understand that the only power now to organize, like what after the Second World War, what happened, how to organize food and medicine to the Germans. I mean, now we are into the Allied occupation forces to Germany. What to do? Actually, they dealt with the Nazis. That's one solution that I don't think is really suitable. We have to create something. And we cannot take off the authenticity and legality of the Palestinian authority. But we can have something transitional in relationship by creating a new kind of leadership. One day in the 1970s, there was, Israel do not want to negotiate with the PLO. Actually, Israel did not negotiate with Hamas. It was Egypt and Qatar and the United States talking in the name of Hamas and Israel. There was, in the 1970s, there was a denial of the international character of the PLO. So there was an idea, what's about if we can get a number of Palestinians who are abroad, people with good reputation, some of them with good experience like Salam Fayyad and Rashid Khaldi and other people who are really Palestinian nationalists, but they made themselves names in the world of Washington and the IMF and so forth. They are capable with a good reputation to start the leadership of the transitional period. In this case only, I will advise myself that we can have a kind of a mix of international and Arab forces to really run the situation, because it's very bad, while also working on the construction of Gaza. On the agreement with the Israelis, that's it. That will be, what the Saudis call the serious pathway to a Palestinian state. The existence of Hamas, my knowledge, and I will speak here, of course, Shai is here, I shouldn't, but Israel will never accept it. And if Israel did not accept, we didn't accept the Muslim brothers in Egypt, no, all kinds of Daesh that they did. You can't take a very purely kind of fundamentalist force and make it, judging. Also the same, we have it in Israel. Now, for the first time in Israel, we don't use to this. I told Shai once, well, you are now part of the Middle East, that we have the people who are open the Torah and like they open the Quran and decide how to do things. Well, the Torah and the Quran are good. They are full of Hebrew prophets and messengers. In the Quran, much more than the Bible, by the way. And for us, it's part of our heritage.
You mean
That's new.
Jewish prophets issuing fatwas?
Yes, they do. We stayed 40 years only in Sinai. So we are having now, by the way, something that put together the three religions in Sinai as a kind of tourist attraction. So that's now I'm making propaganda for that. But other than that, I am saying that I don't think a solution can come with Hamas there. And I must say that the target of talking to the Israelis that we shouldn't have Netanyahu. But that will need work and also the help of the United States. Now I'm not sure that this kind of talk for somebody like President Trump, really he will like it. I mean, a man who talks only with billionaires, talk to somebody who is not a billionaire is really difficult. But I won't say that Hamas will be helpful in the coming period.
I'd like
Do you
to
have just
yeah.
one minute?
Yeah, I'd like to put a little bit perspective on some of the things that Khalil said, because I think that the demands that Hamas is placing now is not what the real story is about. I mean, I think we all know that the demands that Hamas is so-called placing on the issue of humanitarian assistance and all these things that are as if these are the issues. This is not what the story is about. The story is about the fact that from day one, from the morning after October 7, when Israel articulated its actually in the second phase of articulating Israel's objectives, where the eradication of Hamas and the release of the hostages were among the 2 or 3 most important objectives of Israel. From this first day, we have a problem of the inherent tension between these 2 objectives. You're basically trying to get the other side to negotiate some deal that would allow you to say we're achieving one of these objectives, which is the release of the hostages. When you're telling the party with which you're trying to extract this concession that basically you're committed. And Netanyahu keeps reminding again, and there have been already postponements in these last 8 months because this deal that was made, the only thing that happened was that the 2 parties agreed to it. But the deal was on the table since last April. So the deal was in place. The problem is on the Hamas side, and the American negotiators kept reminding us again and again and again that there are big problems that Hamas is placing, but also Netanyahu. And Netanyahu, because he had to live with this contradiction. On one side, he remains committed. He's not. He basically rules out, exactly as Abdel Monem said. He rules out any future within which Hamas is a player. Okay, our position, by the way, in this monograph is different. We are saying both in terms of Hamas, and let's say certain extremists in the Israeli side, that in both cases, everybody should be considered a legitimate player in the political process. In other words, we're not excluding the possibility of Hamas running in the next election. We're not excluding the possibility of Ben Gvir's party running in the next election. What we're saying is, yes, but this has to be based on one principle, which is in all cases, regarding both the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, the governments have to exercise a monopoly of force. Because to be states, this government has to have monopoly of force. So what is excluded is the possibility of an armed Hamas continuing to be a political player. If they want to become a political player, fine, but then they have to disarm. This idea that, because these compromises, we saw what happened. I mean, basically, Lebanon is torn apart. Why? Because in the deal that was made in 1989 to finish the civil war in Lebanon, Hezbollah was excluded from the general idea of disarming the militias. They were given an exemption in the name of the fight against Israel, the resistance, and so on and so forth. Now we see what happens. That goes back to these phenomena in the Middle East of of these armed, it's not just non-state actors, it's armed non-state actors that are tearing these countries apart. If Hamas is permitted to be a player while having continued to have essentially an armed section, then there's also no possibility whatsoever for the PA to become the real government of the Palestinian side.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. This has been a very stimulating discussion, and I'm very interested to hear what reaction you get when you present your book in Washington. Be careful, you may need to write an addendum to this book or even another one, depending upon how things go. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking our three speakers.